For you. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to see a jam-packed room. So welcome to our first CXO Tech Forum. We're so excited to have you here and to show you what we've been working on for the past few months, actually. So thank you, Congressman Connolly. It's a pleasure having you here. I know we are just in your neighborhood, so it wasn't that long of a trek here, right? So it's been an...
Well, actually, given our commute, I probably have one of the longest commutes of any member of Congress when we're in session.
So it's been a really interesting year. So federal IT has kind of gone mainstream. Suddenly you see publications like the Washington Post, USA Today cover issues like cyber attack, encryption, IT modernization. So can you give us a little bit of an overview what's kept you busy when it comes to congressional action and federal IT?
Well, first of all, I do want to say my condition is not permanent. I was in Romania for a NATO meeting. I had the U.S. delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, and many of you may remember the dictator of Romania's name was Ceausescu, and he had a very ugly end when the wall came down and Romania overthrew the communist government. And but one of his last acts was to build a palace that has almost as much square footage as the Pentagon. And it's been turned into the parliament of Romania. And it was raining, and Ceausescu spared no expense in this palace. So all the steps are marble. And I learned the hard way, rain and marble don't mix. So I went down, and this torqued and ripped out everything on the knee. So I'm recovering from that, in case it's not permanent. So yes, what keeps me busy? The foundation for congressional review and parameters of how we manage, procure, and retire IT in the federal government is going to be and is FITARA, also known as Isa Conley or Conley Isa. When he's not around. But that's the fundamental framework through which we're going to look at and measure progress. And as you know, we've set up a scorecard. Again, not to put a scarlet letter on anybody's back, but to try to goad and incentivize our federal workforce to improve and to reach for the stars. But more importantly, it's not a game. We want to make, as Steve said, the technology is a transformative process. It's not a commodity to be managed, though it is also a commodity to be managed. And so how do we kind of get that mindset into the federal government? How do we start effectuating savings? And it's the low-hanging fruit alone's in the billions. And how do we try to make sure that we're using good management principles to allow people to reinvest in themselves if they, in fact, effectuate those savings? And there will be consistent congressional oversight, which was what was missing in the last sort of foundational legislation, which was known as Clinger-Cohen about 20, 25 years ago. Right after that bill passed, Clinger retired and Cohen became Secretary of Defense, where the idea of IT modernization and management just does not exist. Mm-hmm. And so we don't want to repeat that. We want to really establish a different kind of record.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that's one of the most important IT legislation, and FITARA aims to improve how the government manages and buys technology. So how was the process of pushing that through? What was it like, and what were some of the challenges you faced in trying to kind of encourage that?
In the House, we didn't really have a lot of challenges. I think in part, the unlikely pairing of Darrell Issa and Gerry Connolly, people looked at that going, well, if they can agree, who am I to take issue with it, Mm-hmm. But also the subject, this is both good and bad. The subject of IT management and procurement is so arcane that it wasn't like there were 100 actors wanting to put their imprint in this. And so we passed the bill unanimously 3 times in the House, on the House floor. Our problem was the Senate, getting them to take it seriously and do something about it. And also, the other problem was just turf within Congress. We had to be careful that we weren't stepping on the armed services toes, because if we started extending the provisions too explicitly to the Pentagon, then we would have joint referral, which I know sounds like an inside baseball thing, and it is, but it would have probably killed the bill. So we had to stay out of their ball field while still using principles that could be applicable to the Pentagon as a matter of reform over time. So, but in terms of substantive problems, we had worked those out with industry and with government before we actually filed the bill. I personally spent about 4 months meeting with every stakeholder who wanted to talk to me about what their concerns were with the draft bill, and we pretty much worked those out.
That's excellent. So what has gone right with FITARA, and has it lived up to its potential?
I would say we've fallen short of potential for lots of different reasons. I'm disappointed in the progress, for example, on data center consolidation. There are billions of dollars to be saved. When we started out this process, I think Vivek Kundra back in 2009 estimated there were like 1,200 data centers across the federal government. And what happened when we passed our bill and people had to meet metrics? Well, we got good at being more accurate about actually figuring out how many data centers we had.
And there were lots more.
Lots more. You probably know the number, Camille. It's 12,000, close to that.
12,000. Mm-hmm.
So the good news is we did get better in metrics. The not so good news is, well, the goal is consolidate them. Now, some agencies have really made great progress. So I'll give you the two extremes. And if you look at the 4 scorecards we've done already, USAID had a low score. They came to GAO, they came to us, and they said, how can we improve? And they took advice, they took it seriously, and they went from a low score to an A, highest score you can get, in one cycle. Pentagon took a low score and made it lower. And they are now at an F. And they've managed to alienate almost all the players who care about FITARA and the implementation, including GAO. So we're disappointed in some respects, but we are glad that we are slowly empowering CIOs to be able to make decisions. And we are slowly, I hope, elevating the role of primary CIO so that he or she is reporting to the boss and not in the bowels of the agency, that we are beginning to see this more as a process than a commodity to be managed, that there are savings to be had. It's an iterative process. We weren't overly prescriptive in FITARA. Mm-hmm. For example, if I talk to the CEO of a company, I talk to one where's Todd Stottlemyre? Todd, how many CIOs does Inova Healthcare have? 1. Everyone see that? 1. We have 250 CIOs across 24 federal agencies. That's crazy by the private sector standards. Like, what? And what does that produce? This, right? No one's in charge. No one has to take responsibility. It was the other guy's fault. And that's maddening. So we have to move toward a hierarchy that is a modern management model that corporations like Todd's have been using for quite some time. And so getting rid of stovepipes, getting rid of duplication, getting rid of redundancy, retiring legacy systems would save probably or free up $40 to $50 billion a year. This is not chunk change. And that money could be reinvested in the enterprise to make us more efficient, more effective, as we're looking at an environment of constrained resources and budgets. This can be, a real tool for multiplying our ability to get the job done, and looking at new and innovative ways to get the job done. So it's in our own interest to do this. And we want to try to find ways at the congressional level, instead of doing it by fiat, how do we incentivize you? How do we back you up if you're that engine of change, so that we've got your back and we're incentivizing your agency and your managers to want to do the right thing? And that's the approach we've taken. And I think partly it's because most of us who are engaged in this come from the private sector originally.
So why the pushback? Why don't all the 24 CFO agencies have an A on these FITARA scorecards? Like, what is going wrong? Why aren't they doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Well, nothing is simple, right? So there are some agencies where a particular function or division of the agency dominates everything, and they have separate authority from the real CIO for the agency. And so it distorts performance. I won't pick on anybody, but I can think of one at the Department of Transportation. And there are other CIOs who have not been empowered. They want to do the right thing. They want to really modernize their agency, but it's they don't have the attention of the boss. Remember that I think it's only 11 of 24 CIOs of major primary CIOs have permanent status. We still don't have a White House CIO. We still don't have a White House CTO. So a lot of progress is not being made, and who has my back if I want to be that change agent? The other thing is, in a climate, I mean, the Trump budget has done some real damage here. When you've got a budget that cuts your agency 28%, 14%, 32%, and you're the person charged with at least ostensibly implementing that, I'm not sure a CIO coming to you saying, we really need to get rid of some of these legacy systems. Let's spend a couple of $2 billion you don't have on top of that 32% budget cut you got at Department of State or EPA, and move this right up to the top priority. You're really surrounded by alligators. You got all kinds of challenges. You're trying to keep the White House and OMB happy while also answering the Congress that's wondering what the hell are you thinking that you'd cut your budget like that. And you got a workforce that's nervous, and all those things to be managed. I think retiring legacy systems or making IT management procurement one of your top priorities just doesn't happen. It naturally sinks. And given the lack of infrastructure, management infrastructure in this administration so far in that regard, that makes it even worse. So these are all correctable things, but we've lost about 9 months of productive time.
So that brings me to the question of another important legislation that you worked on, the Modernizing Government Technology Act, whose goal is to bring the federal government into the modern era. So what is missing in order to get the government more up to current status?
You're talking about MGT?
Yeah.
Well, I love MGT, and I'm an original co-sponsor of it with Will Hurd, but it is a subset of FITARA. MGT was designed to do two things: create a work fund that could catalyze agencies to retire those legacy systems by having a little bit of working capital to do that. And secondly, to encourage agencies that effectuate savings by data center consolidation or otherwise through FITARA to be able to reinvest that capital instead of giving it back to the Treasury. That's all it does. And those are both good things. We think they're kind of modern management principles. We don't want to disincentivize agencies by, good news, you save $3 billion by doing all the right things. We're slashing your budget this year. Do it again. And then we wonder why performance, kind of sinks after the first round. So we want to try to apply common sense, modern management principles that incentivize behavior we want to achieve rather than disincentivize it. And that's really what MGT is designed to do.
What are some of the technologies you see as most disruptive or impactful when it comes to modernizing the federal government?
Disruptive. Well, I don't know if there's a specific technology that's disruptive or most disruptive, but I would say the biggest challenge we face And by the way, it's not limited to the federal government. It's in the private sector too, as we just saw with Equifax, is cyber, cyber attacks. How do we protect against that? And the problem we've got in the federal government is that we have so many systems, multiple systems within a given agency, competing against each other, incompatible, can't communicate with each other, many of which are too old for modern encryption for protection. They are just vulnerable. And if you think about the databases the federal government has, I mean, I was talking to somebody, I think at CDC, and they get hundreds of millions of cyber attacks. They have, their mission is disease control and prevention and warning, right? They're not cyber experts. And they've had to create a whole new capacity to try to protect themselves against this onslaught that didn't exist 20 years ago. And that's one small federal agency. And you can only imagine what's going on at Treasury or Homeland Security or Department of Defense or divisions within the Department of Defense and so forth. But there are even federal agencies that are vulnerable we don't think about, but they matter. So take Department of Education. Department of Education is vulnerable. Its systems have not been fully modernized and so forth. Well, why do we care about Department of Education? Because Department of Education has data on 40 million American households. You needed a student loan or your kid needed a student loan. They've got your checking account, saving account, your asset sheet, who holds your mortgage, what your mother wore at your wedding, all that stuff. and on 40 million Americans. That's pretty important data. We saw what happened with OPM. Sounds like a bureaucratic agency. Who cares whether OPM, Office of Personnel Management, was breached? Well, 24 million Americans did. But more importantly, if you had filed for a federal job, or if you had sought a security clearance, the keeper of those jewels was OPM. So whoever hacked into OPM, probably the Chinese, now has access to raw security clearance files on anyone who applied during that time period. What could go wrong with that? So, I mean, these are real issues. It's not the sexy, we're never going to win, sexy legislation of the year awards. But to our way of thinking, this is one of the most foundational things we can do to improve the performance of government and better serve the people we represent. And it's not a partisan issue. It's not at all a partisan issue. It is a place where we can come together. And so that's what we're trying to do.
And with technology evolving so fast, what other legislation is needed if we look beyond cybersecurity? What are some other issues in federal IT you would personally like to address?
Well, I'd like to revel in the success of FITARA and just wait for all the awards to come in. There are specific issues like FedRAMP. We want to encourage the federal government to move more to the cloud, to partner more often with the private sector for its domain expertise. The mechanism for accelerating certification for that is FedRAMP. And unfortunately, maybe predictably, FedRAMP hasn't turned out the way we wanted it to. And so instead of being a 6-month low-cost, maybe $250,000 cost for you to go through that process, many companies are finding it a 2 to 3 year process and in the millions. Well, that is exactly the opposite of what we wanted. And, we've got to clean that up. And that may, generally a legislative fix becomes very prescriptive, and Congress doesn't do nuance and subtlety well. And so we can do that, but it will become a rigid framework, right? Somebody will interpret it and decide, yes, we're required to do that, and no, we're not. Well, we want to give more flexibility. We want to try to work out the problem rather than make a point. So we are prepared, and I certainly am prepared, to introduce legislation to address FedRAMP if we become convinced that the executive branch can't fix it. So that's one area. There are lots of other areas we're going to have to look at. There's a conflict between, for some agencies, when you go for that cloud certification, and meanwhile you're trying to stay in compliance with FISMA. So we may have to look at those conflicts. I think they're unintended conflicts, but we don't want to put anyone in the position of violating FISMA while qualifying for providing cloud services. So we want to look at that. And we're going to continue to scorecard FITARA performance. We're going to continue to try to refine the scorecard so that it's fairer and gets a better picture of performance. And we're going to try to work with this White House when they get around to appointing somebody we can talk to about these kinds of issues.
And I know that today we have congressional committees and groups focused on artificial intelligence, IoT. Are you involved in any IoT or AI efforts? Or more emerging technologies?
Yeah, sort of peripherally. I mean, ours has been more, our lane has been more sort of how do we improve federal government performance directly.
The unsexy legislation.
Yeah. But I think we will broaden our scope once we finish this legislative round.
Okay, I think we have a couple of minutes to take questions, and then Congressman has to leave. Steve?
Congressman, you mentioned that there's no federal CIO, no federal chief technology officer, no federal CISO. Can you give some insight? Are there discussions going on to appoint these people, or is it just not even a topic of discussion either on the Hill or at the White House?
Or the other CIO vacancies throughout government.
Or the CIO.
This is my second time around in Congress. My first was as a Senate committee staffer in the 80s during Ronald Reagan's administration. And I would say of all the administrations I've dealt with, the most professional, I mean on top of it, checking in with you twice a day whether they need to or not, was the Reagan years. I mean, I heard from that administration in my duties in the Senate every day, twice a day, 10 times a day. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I was Democrat. That didn't matter. They were checking in. And they were, it was a fruitful relationship. We're 9 months into this administration. I have not had a single communication, phone, email, drop by, anything, about anything from this White House. Not a word.
Do you expect that to change? He doesn't even have to say anything.
There's a lot I expect to change and at least hope to change.
High hopes, low expectations, in
Yeah,
other words.
maybe we could put it that way.
Let's take one more question that's not from Steve. Anyone? Alan Balutis.
Is this working?
1 second, Alan.
Check.
We have a former CIO here, right? Alan?
Thank you. I want to switch the topic just a little bit. The focus of today's session is on health IT. And some of the major obstacles in terms of the applications of technology to healthcare are not technological ones or acquisition ones. It's some of the regulations and legislation that precludes the government from reimbursing on telehealth, telemedicine, those kinds of things. It requires the face-to-face interaction. And I'm sure there are other areas where that's equally true. I know your lane has been focused on the kind of infrastructure, but if government is going and the nation are going to get the benefits of technology, do you see any chances in Congress, or what are the mechanisms in Congress to deal with these other obstacles that are outside the IT and acquisition realm?
Yeah, you raise a really good point, Alan, and we do. We really do need to sort of look at both Medicare and Medicaid and Veterans Administration, for that matter, reimbursement processes and bring them into the 21st century. We have to take cognizance of the fact that things have changed, and the old way of counting what you reimburse and how you reimburse really needs to kind of catch up. And you said some of it isn't technology, but some of it is. I mean, I'll give you a small example, right? So the other day I had to go see the orthopedic surgeon, and I had to fill out all this paperwork, even though the hospital, Todd's hospital, has all the information about me they need, right? They already have a fairly recent file on drugs I take and conditions I've had and do have and all that good stuff. But I filled it all out like I was a brand new person. The PT, the physical therapy place I had to go to yesterday, is on the same floor, same door. They don't even have a separate office. Just instead of going right, you go left. I had to fill out all that paperwork as if 2 days later. I'm thinking, have you guys heard of, I don't know, technology? I mean, I thought we were moving to electronic record keeping and transfer, and it would have been so much more efficient to be able to simply say, we've already got all that. Let me just verify something, or so we're still not there yet, and technology can make us a lot more efficient. I can remember visiting an oncology center with Inova that is the opposite kind of story, where doctors who were kind of resistant to having to do this electronically instead of writing notes or whatever, all of a sudden they could see when they're dealing with a number of patients on chemo, they could look at protocols simultaneously. It was a lot less clunky, a lot more efficient. They could make subtle changes and improve performance simply because the data is immediately available to them on multiple fronts. And so they were singing the praises of, what technology can do for better provision of medicine. So I think it's still a new frontier. I think, there are some medical institutions that are doing better than others, but I think the good news is maybe there's a lot of room for productivity gains in this regard. But the federal government has to take the lead instead of being sort of a laggard in recognizing what the new environment has done in terms of services and what it's going to reward by way of reimbursement. And we're nowhere near there yet.
I know you have a hard stop at 9:10, so you got to get to your appointment.
I'm going to PT.
I didn't want to say anything, but yeah. Congressman, it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.